Today I want to cover contemporary planning approaches, and I do apologise in advance for those of you in the room who have knowledge of planning, but I was asked to go back to basics. I want to talk about processes for what we call best practice planning, if such a thing exists, and I want to talk about principles of best practice planning. And then I couldn't help myself, I want to go back to the future, and I want to just highlight some what I'm calling killer issues for planning towards a sustainable Moreton Bay environment. And that'll become clear as to why I've gone back to look at something in the past. So let's deal with contemporary planning approaches first. First of all, we are using an approach to planning in Queensland, in other states in Australia, other parts of the world, which can be called values-led planning. And what do we mean by that? Societal values are driving planning, or should drive planning. Well, obviously there's environmental values, social values, economic values, and the overlap is where we bring together what we might call community values. So it's those community values that planners should attempt to elicit in order to drive forward planning. The question is, whose values are used in the planning process? Is it the politicians that organise the planning and give purpose to the planning? Is it the planners themselves? Of course, I'm an educator at Griffith University, and my message to my students is, well, no, just because we've been to university and got a 4-year planning degree, we don't have community values. You must engage with the community to elicit their values. So that's the message. And when you transfer those community values into values of the landscape, these are the sorts of things we're talking about. Habitation values, where people live, and it's not just the cities, is it? There's a whole raft of sort of rural residential peri-urban areas, there's rural areas and the like. There's rural production values, in other words, where good quality ag land is situated. We need to protect that for our produce and so on. Biodiversity values, nature conservation. There's outdoor recreation values, where people recreate, and there's more and more recreation in this part of the world than others. It's a well-recognised activity. There's also scenic amenity values, there's cultural heritage values, and there's Indigenous values. So somehow we need to understand all those values, and another way to look at that in more contemporary language that's in the literature is through an ecosystem services approach. What value does nature have for humankind? What exercises does it perform? That's just another layer over those values. But the point I make here is, it's a contested landscape. It's a highly contested landscape. So planning, one of the purposes of planning is decontesting those values, trying to look at some rational way to deal with those contested values. The other approach to planning which we advocate is sometimes referred to as science-informed planning. In other words, we're not planning from the seed of our plants, we're not plucking things out of the air, we're basing it on science. In other words, we're basing it on evidence. It's evidence-based planning. So when you look at a plan, ask the question, this policy, on what evidence is it based? On what science has been used to inform that? And the sort of science I'm talking about is physical science, biological science, socioeconomic science, climate science, water science, technological science, citizen science. Think about all those farmers out there that have been operating the landscape for generations. How much knowledge have they got? And the last form of science I would advocate is Indigenous knowledge. I mean, heck, I just said in my acknowledgement that the traditional owners have been managing this landscape for millenniums. I mean, that is embedded into their knowledge. So why not understand how Indigenous communities have managed this landscape? So that's the sort of science that we need to bring into planning. Ask yourself the question, what evidence in the planning that you're looking at is based on that form of science? Another approach to planning is what we call planning at the landscape scale. The word scale has nothing to do with the sense of spatial dimensions. It's not local or national. What we mean by scale is how the Europeans look at it. It's, as I quote there from Paul Salmon, who's a well-respected landscape planner from the University of Sheffield. Salmon says it's an area as perceived by people whose character is the result of actions and interactions of natural and human or human factors. In other words, folks, we need to not just look at the biophysical science or the biophysical environment, not just look at the socio-economic environment, but the overlap, which what we call the socio-ecological system. In other words, it's where humans impact with the natural environment. That's the scale we need to be planning. Not just for the birds and bees by themselves, not just for humans by themselves, but where humans interact with that natural environment. That's landscape scale. If we do that, then unashamedly, planning is anthropocentric. It's all about planning for communities, planning for humankind. And also, that socio-ecological system, the intersection of the natural and the human, is also what we call the resistance. So if you want to talk about what makes systems resilient, it's about resilient systems. And you need to look at both the natural and the social. If you do want to transfer that into some sort of spatial area that you apply a landscape scale, then it's what we call the metropolitan scale. It's not just planning for cities. It's not just planning for the urban area. You hear people talk about urban planning or city planning. Well, folks, no city or no town exists only in that artificial entity. It exists in a region. And as I said, some of the values, people in the city, where do they recreate on weekends? It's out in the regions. They're bushwalking, they're camping, they're riding horses, riding trail bikes. Where do they go fishing? Right? So we've got to connect the urban area, that human interaction, with the natural environment. So that's the scale that we've got to start planning at. We also need to take long-term views about the world. In other words, strategic planning. That's important. You don't just plan for a site, 600 square metres or a couple of hectares. That exists in some sort of context. So we need to take a strategic view. In other words, strategic planning gives us the ability to be proactive, not reactive. I mean, you're sitting in this room today because you're reacting to a plan. Why shouldn't it be more the other direction, a proactive approach? In other words, folks, no surprises. If there was proper strategic planning, there would be no surprises. You're sitting in this room here because not only are you reacting, but you've got a big surprise. Well, that's not planning. So, strategic plans. This is the time scale. We're looking at 25 plus years. The strategic planning we're doing now in this part of the world is looking at 2041. 2041. Just think about that. Now, if we can get that right, and of course we can't predict the future, no one can predict the future, but you can damn well work out what are possible futures and plan accordingly. But that approach, sorry, I'm a Mac person, so my Mac PowerPoint is going a bit funny. That word is community vision up the top there. I'll just put up. All right. So you take community visions and you project them into the future, and you aim, you direct all your policies, you direct all your programs that you're funding through your budgets towards that community vision. It's what keeps it on track. Ask yourself the question, the developments that you're now surprised by, were they part of a community vision? Rest my case. The other approach to planning is what I call joined up planning. In other words, let's all row in the same direction. So here I'm going to use the example of the South East Queensland Regional Plan, and that's a statutory document, by the way, which is currently being upgraded, and the current government intends to have a draft out by August and a final version by mid-next year. You better watch that space. And then this is the Natural Resource Management Plan. So that is a statutory document. That's got the force of law behind it. This is a non-statutory document. So the idea is to link that up. And you can link them up. It's been done. Whether the current government will continue this process is another story. But look, visions are aligned, targets are aligned. Now, the benefit of doing that is you start to align investments, because every planning policy will have a number of programs hanging off it. And it's those programs that governments budget and fund in their annual budgets. And so in theory, you shouldn't have a planning program unless it can be funded. But the question is the plan aligned to the investment? And the answer is generally no. So that's another challenge, to get alignment between planning policy and planning investment. And when I say investment, what are we investing in? Well, you are paying, or you have paid, your hard-earned taxes to the government. So what's the government do with those taxes? They use them and they spend your hard-earned taxes to improve your quality of life. End of story. It's a question of what assets they spend that money on. Well, they spend it on roads, don't they? We've got bucket loads of freeways, bucket loads of bridges, bucket loads of sewage treatment plants in the cities. We also have social infrastructure. And ain't that the sort of policy agenda for the current election? Education, schools, that's social infrastructure. And the third infrastructure is environmental infrastructure. I mean, my argument is, why shouldn't the government be spending on all three forms of infrastructure if they're going to improve our quality of life? Our quality of life just doesn't come from more freeways. It just doesn't come from more hospitals. It comes from having adequate open space. And it has adequate outdoor recreation areas and so on. And if you can somehow align all that infrastructure, you get a whole of government coordinated infrastructure approach, rather than each department spending its priority funding on roads or hospitals or whatever. So that's the holy grail of planning. So when we talk about joined up planning, up the top there are some examples of a whole spate of individual plans that government departments have beavered away at and produced on your behalf. The question is, are they all rowing in the same direction? So somehow we need to bring those together in that statutory regional plan. That's the overall goal. And as I said, at the moment, it's only the natural resource management plan that's really aligned to that statutory plan. There's more work to be done. But in doing so, you then provide linkages, as I said, on the right, the infrastructure plans. On the left is the monitoring approach to look at the state of the region reports. And you also have linkages down to local government plans. Surprise, surprise. Councils should not be operating on their own. They should be operating under the umbrella of the statutory regional plan. The policies in that statutory regional plan should cascade down into local authority statutory plans. Do they? No. I'll leave the question open. But anyway, there's a piece of legislation sitting out there in the state government that says that's what's supposed to happen. So let me now move on to process for best practice planning processes. The best process that is advocated comes in this form: a cyclic or a continuous planning process. How many planning processes have you seen that start, big announcement by a politician, sorry Tony, and all of a sudden, cameras and bands playing, they go through a year's planning and they produce the plan, another big public relations exercise, and that's it. And then a few years' time, start it all over again. Well, no, planning should be continuous. It should happen all the time. And there's benefits in doing that. So without boring you with this, it just says you start a division, you go through and you look at all the facts and the data, you look at then simulating a number of different alternatives. You cannot come up with the plan straight off. You've got to look at different options. And that's probably where you should be doing an EIS in there, by the way, not at the end of the process. Then you evaluate, then you select, and then you implement. So planners are taught not just how to make plans, but how to implement plans. The key to planning is proper implementation. Proper implementation. Because what's the point of planning if you don't check to see whether it's achieving what it started out, it doesn't make sense. So we use a cyclic planning approach. And there it is there. But look at this. There's a learning process. Hey, we're human beings. We are part of the animal kingdom. Now, what's kept animals evolving and surviving? Because they've learnt. They've learnt to adapt, haven't they? To changing climate, to changing environments. Well, humans should be doing the same. Now, it's pretty silly if we don't start learning from implementation what works and what doesn't work. So, there's an example of the plan I mentioned before, and the next plan is due next year. So what's happening? Well, we should be monitoring and evaluating for these signposts. There's that signpost there which says, hey, we're approaching a dangerous curve in the road and we're going to fall off the cliff if we don't do something about it. And there's also other signposts which says, hey, here's an opportunity. If we change direction, we can avail ourselves of that opportunity. So they're the sorts of issues that should be monitored, evaluated and reported. But then the major part of this, what we call adaptive management framework, is the learning process. That one up there. This is where we introduce new science. How many times have you heard people say, oh, you can't plan because we haven't got enough science? Stop the world until we get the science. Well, sorry, it ain't going to happen. Right? So we need a continuous planning process where that new science can come on board and evolve. We also need to look at new growth projections. You know, demographers are changing projections. I mean, I was going to say my good friend, but he's not really. Bernard Salt. Well, he's your friend, Ted. He came out about a month ago and said Southeast Queensland, from the special demographic studies that his firm has done, said we're now going into zero growth in Southeast Queensland. Whereas we've taken 1 million people into this region in the last decade. 1 million people. I mean, that's almost 1/20th of the Australian population. 1/20th, folks, picked up their bongos and moved to Southeast Queensland. That's what's driving planning. It's growth planning. So, we need to understand the new growth projections. If Bernard Salt's correct, well, we need to plan it. I'm not saying he is. I haven't seen any robust demographic data from ABS to suggest that. But look up here, new learnings. We are learning to do better planning all the time. Why don't we put that back into the planning process? We don't do it. We don't do it. We're our own worst enemies. So we need to get a proper adaptive management framework embedded in the planning processes in this state. And councils need to do it as well. Local authorities need it. This is very important, and I'm sure I'm not going to have many people objecting to what I'm about to say here in this room today. You need to plan with the community. You need to embrace what we call a community engagement approach. From an international association of public participation comes this model, levels of engagement. If you go from left to right, you're getting increasing levels of public engagement, community engagement. Look, on the far left, you can have informing. So people will say, oh, we're engaging with the community, we're informing you that we're about to do this development. That's minimal. That's the minimalist approach. Then you go consulting, then you involve people, then you collaborate. Goodness me. But folks, look at the right-hand highest degree of level of engagement. You empower communities to do the planning with you. So a lot of the research that I'm doing right now is looking at smaller communities, both in Australia and, would you believe, in China, to see how do communities self-empower themselves to get on and do what we call community-led planning. Stephen, I haven't got time to go into community-led planning, but that's another area that I think this audience would love to... What, I'm running out of time? Oh, well, mate, sorry. All right, well, I'm running out of time. Principles of best practice planning. There's the precautionary principle. Sorry, I'm just going to flash these up now, but I have left a PDF of my slides for you. But here, look, the key components of the precautionary principle: taking preventative action when uncertain, making sure the advocates of an activity are responsible for the burden of proof. And investigating a wide range of possibilities and alternatives, not the first thing that comes into your head. Principles of subsidiarity. right? Delegate right down, transfer power down to the lowest level. Integration principle, that's where you effectively integrate long-term, short-term, economic, social, cultural, environmental issues and so on, urban and regional. ESD principle, ecological sustainable development, it's defined by the Commonwealth of Australia and it's embedded into most planning legislation throughout Australia. Yes, it was embedded into the Integrated Planning Act of '97, State Level Planning Act of 2009, and the new Planning Act, which is 2016, it's come into effect next year. It's not in effect yet. It's got a Weasley term there called ecological sustainability. I won't have time to go into that now, but you can follow that up if you want to see whether or not there's been a watering down from the ESD approach back in the '97 Integrated Planning Act. There's the biodiversity principle. There's principles of resilience, which I've mentioned before. But look, a resilience approach has to accept there are limits to growth. Has to accept there's a carrying capacity for any landscape, be it small or large. Has to accept that there are such things as ecological footprints, and those footprints either consume resources that we don't have or not. There's thresholds in this world. In other words, there's tipping points. This is a resilience theory. Go beyond that tipping point and you morph yourself into an organisation or a society or a community or a landscape you didn't want to go to. So it goes to a question of scale. Is a development of such horrendous scale, it's going beyond natural tipping points that you can't come back from? Systems redundancy. Does the plan inbuild redundancy to cater for uncertainty, to cater for things that can't be foreseen? As I said, we can't predict. There's a need to adapt in this approach. Now, look, I've gone through all of this already. That was just a summary. So let me just do back to the future, some killer issues. I wrote a chapter in this 1998 book about planning for Moreton Bay, and I went back and reread it. And this is how I concluded, quote, "There is as yet no effective cooperative mechanism capable of producing a more integrated set of holistic initiatives, nor overseeing the effective implementation. In the quest for effective planning for change, the avoidance of future management with the uncertainty is perhaps the holy grail of planning and management for our Moreton Bay." I wrote that in '98. And I'm about to write another chapter for the forum this year. I reckon I'll conclude on the same thing. What's happened in those times? We don't learn, do we? We just don't learn. Okay, planning for Moreton Bay. So, the questions I put for you to ask yourselves: do current planning practices reflect contemporary planning approaches that I've outlined? Have current planning practices adopted processes of best practice planning processes? That should be a 3. This is an unusual computer, Chris. Is current planning underpinned by principles of good practice planning? And I want to highlight something for you. You may or may not be aware of this. South East Queensland is one of the highest vulnerable hotspots for climate change in Australia. Why? Well, look at that. And look at the population growth. I mean, until Bird and Salt came along, that's the growth trends that we're on for the region. Another 1 million people packing their bongos coming here. We've got to stop advertising this place. But look at this. There's the pink. Watch the pink areas. That's the urban footprint in 1970. There it is in 2006. Now, without planning and without intervention, there it is by 2026. So in other words, we're developing in the areas of least resistance. Developers develop in areas of least resistance. The coastal plains. So the question is, do you want the coast entirely urbanised? Or do you want it broken up? Do you want discrete cities? So Brisbane doesn't become Gold Coast, doesn't become Sunshine Coast. So that's the reason. High population growth and the fact that we're putting people in harm's way. And look at this. There's the science. from CSIRO, downscale science for South East Queensland. Haven't got time to go into it, I'm sorry. These are the impacts. They're the impacts that planning on the coast has to deal with in South East Queensland. So the question is, what scenario should we plan for? All right, so there's that sign. That's just one example, but it's the killer one for me. When you're talking about coastal development, when you're talking about Toondah Harbour and you're talking about shoreline. The other question is, there's ANZ's ladder of citizen participation, which many of you in the room would know. Where do you want to be? At the manipulation bottom rung? Or do you want to be at the citizen control delegated power? So empowerment is at the top of the ladder. Where are you as a community positioned by your council and by the state government in their planning processes? That's the killer question. And what role of the planner? What do you want of us? What do you want of us? Do you want us to be resolving land use conflicts? Do you want us to be the negotiators? We can do all of this. Do you want us to be mediators? The last one I'm not too sure about.
We're going to have to be.
You're going to have to be, yes. Okay, so thank you.